Made in America, The Supply Chain Revolution. A multi-part docuseries exploring the resurgence of American manufacturing. Tech's Homecoming, the role of semiconductor shortages in boosting U.S. chip manufacturing. Introduction. The supply chain wake-up call. The global economy has long relied on intricate, interconnected supply chains stretching across continents, with manufacturing hubs concentrated in regions like East Asia. For decades, this system delivered efficiency, cost savings, and scale, particularly in the production of semiconductors, the tiny chips that power everything from smartphones to fighter jets. However, the fragility of these global networks was laid bare by a series of disruptions starting in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic, geopolitical tensions, natural disasters, and trade disputes. These events triggered a global semiconductor shortage that rippled across industries, halted production lines, and exposed the vulnerabilities of relying heavily on foreign manufacturing. In response, the United States has embarked on an ambitious journey to bring manufacturing back home, particularly in the semiconductor sector. This docuseries, Made in America, The Supply Chain Revolution, explores how supply chain disruptions have catalyzed a renaissance in American manufacturing, with a focus on the semiconductor industry's pivotal role. Part 1, Tech's Homecoming, delves into the causes and consequences of the semiconductor shortage, the U.S. government's response through the CHIPS and Science Act, and the broader implications for economic and national security. The semiconductor shortage, a perfect storm. The anatomy of a crisis. Semiconductors, often called the oil of the digital age, are critical components in virtually every modern device, from consumer electronics to medical equipment, automobiles, and defense systems. In 2020, the world faced an unprecedented semiconductor shortage, described by the U.S. Department of Commerce as a perfect storm of supply and demand imbalances. The crisis began with a confluence of factors. Pandemic-induced disruptions. The COVID-19 pandemic triggered widespread factory shutdowns, particularly in East Asia, where 75% of global semiconductor manufacturing capacity is concentrated. Lockdowns in countries like China and Taiwan disrupted production, while port delays and logistics bottlenecks slowed the delivery of chips. For example, restrictions at the port of Yantian in southern China caused significant delays in global shipping. Surging demand. As the world shifted to remote work and online learning, demand for electronics, laptops, gaming consoles, and smart devices skyrocketed. This surge overwhelmed an already strained supply chain. The automotive industry, which relies heavily on chips for everything from engine control to infotainment systems, was particularly hard hit, with production halts costing an estimated $110 billion in 2021 alone. Geopolitical tensions, U.S.-China trade disputes and export controls on advanced semiconductor technologies added further complexity. For instance, restrictions on China's Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation, SMIC, limited its access to critical equipment, impacting global supply. Natural disasters, a series of black swan events, including factory fires in Japan, a drought in Taiwan, and severe winter storms in Texas, exacerbated the shortage. These events disrupted the production of silicon wafers and other critical components, highlighting the fragility of concentrated manufacturing hubs. The result was a dramatic reduction in chip inventories. According to the U.S. Department of Commerce, median inventories for key semiconductor products dropped from 40 days in 2019 to less than 5 days in 2021. This meant that even a brief disruption, such as a 2-week factory shutdown, could cripple industries reliant on chips. Economic and social impacts. The semiconductor shortage had far-reaching consequences. In the automotive sector, companies like Ford, General Motors, and Volkswagen were forced to idle factories, lay off workers, and prioritize certain models over others. Apple reported a $6 billion loss in sales due to chip constraints, underscoring the vulnerability of even the largest corporations. Inflation rose as vehicle prices surged, contributing to 1/3 of the elevated core inflation in 2021. Beyond economics, the shortage raised national security concerns. Semiconductors are integral to advanced military systems, including the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter and Javelin anti-tank missiles. The reliance on foreign chips, particularly from Taiwan and South Korea, which produce 100% of the world's most advanced chips, below 10 nanometers, exposed vulnerabilities in U.S. defense capabilities. The crisis was a wake-up call, prompting policymakers, industry leaders, and the public to rethink the structure of global supply chains. The phrase, supply chain resilience, became a rallying cry, and the U.S. government took bold steps to address the issue. The CHIPS Act, a game-changer for U.S. manufacturing. Legislative response. In 2022, President Joe Biden signed the CHIPS and Science Act, a landmark piece of legislation aimed at revitalizing U.S. semiconductor manufacturing. The act allocated $52.7 billion in incentives, including $39 billion for manufacturing and a 25% tax credit for capital investments, to bolster domestic production. An additional $200 billion was directed toward research and development, R&D, and workforce development to ensure long-term competitiveness. The CHIPS Act was a response to a stark reality. The U.S. share of global semiconductor manufacturing had plummeted from 37% in 1990 to just 10% by 2022. Meanwhile, Taiwan and South Korea dominated advanced chip production, with Taiwan alone accounting for 92% of chips below 10 nanometers. The act aimed to reverse this decline by incentivizing companies to build and expand fabrication facilities, fabs, in the U.S. Industry investments. The CHIPS Act sparked a wave of private sector investment. Since its passage, companies have announced nearly $450 billion in investments across 25 states, with major players like Intel, TSMC, Samsung, and Micron leading the charge. Notable projects include Intel, a $20 billion investment to build 2 new fabs in Ohio, with plans to expand further. Intel's CEO emphasized that the CHIPS Act funding would accelerate and scale these projects. TSMC, the Taiwanese chip giant, is constructing 2 fabs in Arizona, with production delayed to 2025 due to labor shortages but bolstered by CHIPS Act incentives. Samsung, the South Korean company, is expanding its Texas facilities, leveraging U.S. incentives to increase production capacity. Micron, the U.S.-based memory chip manufacturer, is building the nation's largest chip fab, aiming to strengthen domestic DRAM production. These investments are projected to triple U.S. semiconductor manufacturing capacity by 2032, increasing the U.S. share of global fab capacity from 10% to 14%, the first increase in decades. The U.S. is also expected to gain a 28% share of advanced logic chip production, up from 0% in 2022. Beyond manufacturing, a holistic approach. The CHIPS Act goes beyond building factories. It addresses critical areas like R&D, chip design, and workforce development. The U.S. remains a leader in chip design and electronic design automation, EDA, but these areas require continued investment to maintain competitiveness. The Act also emphasizes growing the STEM talent pipeline to address labor shortages, a significant challenge for new fabs. Challenges and hurdles. Labor shortages. Despite the promise of the CHIPS Act, the resurgence of U.S. chip manufacturing faces significant challenges. A critical hurdle is the shortage of skilled workers. The U.S. has outsourced much of its semiconductor manufacturing to Asia over the past few decades, leading to a decline in domestic expertise. TSMC's Arizona fab, for example, delayed production due to a lack of workers with suitable skills. To address this, universities and community colleges are creating new semiconductor-focused programs, offering hands-on training and shorter certification courses. However, building a robust workforce will take years, and companies may face higher labor costs or underutilized factories in the interim. High costs. Manufacturing chips in the U.S. is significantly more expensive than in Asia. TSMC's founder, Morris Chang, noted that producing chips in the U.S. could cost 55% more than in Taiwan due to higher labor, energy, and infrastructure costs. The CHIPS Act subsidies and tax credits aim to offset these costs, but long-term competitiveness will require sustained government support. Geopolitical risks. The semiconductor industry remains vulnerable to geopolitical tensions, particularly between the U.S. and China. China's export controls on critical materials like gallium and germanium, announced in 2023, raised fears of a second chip shortage. Meanwhile, U.S. export controls on advanced chips and equipment to China have strained global supply chains, potentially limiting access to key components. Environmental and infrastructure challenges. Semiconductor manufacturing is energy and water-intensive, raising concerns about sustainability and infrastructure. The U.S. power grid is increasingly unstable, and natural disasters like hurricanes and droughts could disrupt production. Companies must invest in disaster recovery plans to mitigate these risks. The broader impact, reshoring and economic resilience. A new era of manufacturing. The semiconductor shortage and the CHIPS Act have broader implications for American manufacturing. The push to reshore chip production is part of a larger, Made in America, movement, driven by both economic and national security imperatives. By reducing reliance on foreign suppliers, the U.S. aims to insulate itself from future disruptions, whether caused by pandemics, trade wars, or natural disasters. The automotive, aerospace, and defense industries, which were severely impacted by the chip shortage, are particularly supportive of reshoring efforts. Partnerships like Ford's collaboration with GlobalFoundries and GM's agreements with 7 chip producers demonstrate a shift toward securing domestic supply chains. Economic benefits. The resurgence of U.S. chip manufacturing is expected to create thousands of high-paying jobs and stimulate local economies, particularly in states like Arizona, Ohio, and Texas. The Semiconductor Industry Association, SIA, estimates that semiconductors directly and indirectly contribute $2.7 trillion to global GDP, and increasing U.S. production could boost economic growth. However, critics warn that job growth projections may be optimistic, and high costs could limit the economic benefits. The complexity of the semiconductor supply chain, which involves over 70 international border crossings for a single chip, means that complete self-sufficiency is unlikely. Instead, the U.S. is pursuing a friendshoring strategy, encouraging production in allied countries like Mexico, Vietnam, and Malaysia. National security. The national security implications of the chip shortage cannot be overstated. The U.S. Department of Defense, DoD, relies on advanced chips for weapons systems, and the lack of domestic production poses a significant risk. The CHIPS Act's funding is administered primarily through the Department of Commerce, but the DoD retains a role in ensuring access to cutting-edge technologies like AI and quantum computing. Global context, a shifting landscape. International efforts. The U.S. is not alone in addressing semiconductor supply chain vulnerabilities. The European Union launched its own European CHIPS Act to increase resilience and reduce dependence on Asian suppliers. China has invested heavily in its domestic chip industry through the Integrated Circuit Industry Investment Fund, though it faces challenges due to U.S. export controls. Japan, South Korea, and India are also offering subsidies to bolster local production. These global efforts could lead to overcapacity in some segments of the market, potentially driving down prices but also creating new bottlenecks if investments are not market-based. The SIA warns that non-market-driven policies, such as those in China, could disrupt the global semiconductor value chain. Taiwan's dominance. Taiwan, home to TSMC, remains the epicenter of advanced chip production. Its 92% share of sub-10 nanometer chip manufacturing makes it indispensable to the global economy. However, its proximity to China and vulnerability to natural disasters like earthquakes and typhoons highlight the risks of over-reliance. The U.S. and its allies are working to diversify production, but Taiwan is likely to retain a dominant position for decades. Chapter 6, Looking Ahead, the future of U.S. chip manufacturing. Sustaining momentum. The CHIPS Act has set the stage for a manufacturing renaissance, but its success depends on sustained investment and policy support. The act is set to expire in 2027, and its renewal is uncertain. Without continued funding, the U.S. risks falling behind in the global race for semiconductor leadership. The SIA and Boston Consulting Group recommend extending CHIPS Act incentives, expanding tax credits to cover chip design, and investing in workforce development to ensure long-term success. Additionally, the U.S. must address supply chain risks beyond manufacturing, such as access to raw materials like silicon wafers and rare earth elements. Innovation and resilience. The U.S. maintains a strong position in chip design, EDA, and manufacturing equipment, but it must continue to innovate to stay competitive. Emerging technologies like chiplets, which allow for modular chip designs, and post-CMOS technologies, such as photonic and quantum computing, offer opportunities to leapfrog competitors. Building resilient supply chains will require a balance between domestic production and global collaboration. The U.S. cannot achieve complete self-sufficiency, but strategic partnerships with allies and robust risk management can mitigate vulnerabilities. A cultural shift. The semiconductor shortage and the CHIPS Act have sparked a broader conversation about the role of manufacturing in America's future. For decades, the U.S. prioritized design and innovation over production, outsourcing manufacturing to lower-cost regions. The current crisis has shown that manufacturing is not just about economics, it's about security, resilience, and sovereignty. The Made in America movement is more than a policy shift, it's a cultural one. As companies, workers, and communities rally around the goal of rebuilding U.S. manufacturing, the nation has an opportunity to redefine its industrial identity for the 21st century. Conclusion. A new chapter for American manufacturing. The semiconductor shortage was a stark reminder of the fragility of global supply chains and the strategic importance of domestic manufacturing. Through the CHIPS and Science Act, the U.S. is taking bold steps to reclaim its place in the semiconductor industry, with far-reaching implications for the economy, national security, and technological leadership. Tech's homecoming is just the beginning. As the U.S. builds new fabs, trains a new generation of workers, and navigates global challenges, it is laying the foundation for a more resilient and innovative future. The road ahead is fraught with challenges, labor shortages, high costs, and geopolitical risks, but the stakes could not be higher. The resurgence of American chip manufacturing is not just about producing chips, it's about securing the future of technology and redefining what "Made in America" means in a globalized world.